Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's Ali here from Isentia. Welcome to another Isentia Conversations webinar, which is all about communicating through change. So we've got some special guests today joining us like we do every week. And who you're going to be hearing from today is me, but you're also going to be hearing from Craig Dowling, who's the Head of Communications at Mercury, and Ngaire Crawford, who is the Insights Director at Isentia. And so before we get too stuck into things, just a little bit of housekeeping. We do have everyone's microphones muted, so we don't have a unmuting background noise situation. We've all been spending so much time on video calls. I'm sure we've all got a story of something like that over the last couple of weeks, but we would definitely love your questions today, and we've got lots of time at the end of the session to answer those questions as well. And so the best place to put those is to type them out and to put them in the questions or the chat area on the GoToWebinar panel, which should be on the right hand side of your screen. So just pop those questions in there at any time. And that is also the best place to let us know if you're experiencing any technical difficulties. We've got our CX manager, Daniel, on hand today to respond to those as well. All right, so what are we going to be doing today? What we've been doing in these webinars is first weekly and then fortnightly, just talking about what's going on in the world. We started this session because we saw an opportunity to connect people and connect with you while we are all adapting and going through such a time of massive change. And if we think back to March and April, there's been some real ups and downs. There's been so much that has changed. At the start of this, we were talking about how can we work productively from home. We've started to talk about recovery and to be able to reflect on what the past couple of months have been like. And that is what Craig's going to do for us today. He's going to reflect on what his experience has been like. What happens when you've got best laid plans that maybe can't quite work out because of a pandemic? So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about Craig's work history as well, and the wealth of experience that he's bringing to this session. So head of comms at Mercury, 3 years in the energy sector. And if you're not familiar with Mercury, that's one of New Zealand's big 5 electricity generator retailers. And so before the 3 years in the energy sector, prior to that, Craig had over a decade of corporate comms experience in the financial sector. And that includes American Express, Westpac, and headed up corporate comms for IAG. And something else that could be, if we're really going back and reflecting, something that could be interesting today as well is that Craig was at Westpac through the GFC and at IAG working in insurance around the response to the Canterbury earthquake. So in terms of crisis comms, Craig, that's kind of your bag. You've done a little bit of that. We've also got Ngaire Crawford today, sorry. We've got Ngaire Crawford, who's our Insights Director for Australia and New Zealand at Isentia, and Ngaire runs our Media Research Division. And Ngaire is absolutely passionate about communication, so much so that she's also the chair of the Global Young Leaders Group for AMAC, which is the International Association for the Measurement and Education of Communication. And every week, every fortnight in one of these sessions, Ngaire has been reflecting on what is it that's going on in the world? What are we seeing in the media? So Ngaire, what's happening? What can you share with us today?
So what the overarching media narrative is at the moment is that we're moving into this phase of what is the future going to look like and trying to predict what that is. Unfortunately, it's quite gloomy at the moment because a lot of it is really about economic impact and how long that recovery may be. So for anyone that tuned into the last webinar, I was talking a little bit about how we were at that stage of a crisis when everyone's looking for that apology. Everyone wants someone to blame. There's this real thirst for an apology. Where we're at now is it's a bit more about what's next and trying to predict what that real personal impact of everything might be. So mainstream media particularly are very focused on economic impact, so property, personal wealth, government response. For New Zealand, this has meant a lot of focus on our upcoming election and a change in leadership for the opposition, and all of these things are very all tied together. There's also still a lot of coverage on restrictions easing, and then the flip side of that is as restrictions ease and cases go down, there's a lot more coverage about individual cases. So particularly things that would cause people anxiety around a case in a particular region or a case of someone in a particular age. There's a bit more focus on those. But other than that, news is starting to resemble kind of normal again. And by that, I mean there's a lot more kind of celebrity general news and all of that kind of stuff that you would expect. For social media, what we're seeing is the anxiety about physical distancing is obviously starting to ease up. People are more familiar with what the world looks like with eased restrictions and post-lockdowns, but it is very much that anxiety is starting to turn towards that economic downturn and what that's going to look like. And certainly in the last fortnight, there have been a lot more specific announcements around job losses and what companies are going to have to do to course correct and all of that kind of stuff. I use Google Trends, and I recommend everyone to use Google Trends as just a bit of an insight into what people are looking for, what they might not have information on. In Australia and New Zealand, there's still a lot of questions around the apps in both regions. The other thing is people are Googling about individual cases. So one of the leading searches in Australia at the moment is very much about the case in Blackwater and the fact that that man was 30. And then the other, what is probably symptomatic of life returning to normal a little bit, is that by far the largest search is actually about like Lady Gaga's new album. And then a lot of other celebrity news around kind of Josh Reynolds and all of those types of things too. So if you want to flick to the next slide, Ali. What I want to do from that media trend is just encourage everybody to think a little bit more about the future. We've done a lot of evaluation of, what good communication has looked like during COVID, and I think now is the time to think about how you might apply some of those learnings. What can you do to modify your communications, crisis response? And also very much think about what communications looks like during an economic downturn. Not everybody would have been through an economic downturn in communications, and I think it is one of the times that you can be incredibly innovative and creative about how you demonstrate your value to the rest of your organization. And it's incredibly important to know your value and think about how it is that you would show your organization how you contribute to those kind of core business objectives. I also wanted to add in a bit of a story to watch, and I'm going to hope to do these in the next ones as well. But there is definitely some really interesting conversations brewing around PR ethics and misinformation, and the role of PR in misinformation. And especially with the news around the White House and the executive order to potentially prosecute the social media networks and to make it so that they can't hide behind, or they can be liable for content that is posted on those platforms. That will also reignite that really interesting debate around what the role of tech is in ethics and communication, that I think is incredibly fascinating. So if you haven't had a look at either of those kind of media stories that are brewing, do go have a look, because they will get a bit bigger. And I think anything that is about misinformation and ethics is incredibly important to know and understand as a comms professional at the moment. But I will now pass over to Craig, because I know I'm very excited to hear from Craig. So take it away, Craig.
Thank you, Ngaire. I've really valued these sessions to date. Hopefully it can carry on and add some value to this one. I think the insights that Isentia has provided has been very useful to me in thinking about what is important to our audiences. So I'd encourage anyone else listening into this version of the conversation to also go back and refresh on the past. One thing that I've found over the response to COVID is a bit of COVID brain. I've probably learned more in the last sort of 8 weeks than I had in the prior 8 months, and I've forgotten most of it at the same time. It kind of goes in, and I think there's a lot of value to go back to some of the lessons that we learn to take us forward and build in habits as a result. And if I look back over some of the previous episodes, which I did to warm up for this, and I saw some of the insights, like just the basic comms messages of clarity, compassion, and creativity, sticking to those, they'll hold us sort of true to the course through the, I guess, the ups and downs that are still going to come through this COVID thing. And that's probably one of the little insights out of having been around a couple of other types of crises. They're all different how they apply. But probably the biggest parallel I probably see is the Canterbury earthquakes, which was a long running issue for those directly impacted. And I do think that the grief cycle that is another little model to look at, the fact that our customers and people we work with, our partners, and even the people in our business will be going through a cycle of response that can last days, weeks, months, or years. And it was years in the situation with Canterbury, and it could be with some of the COVID stuff too. So I think reading the audience, which was another earlier message in one of these conversations, is going to be critical. We faced having to do that, so it's a long story, a long intro into talking about what I was going to talk about, which was that we had a range of things planned for the year, as everyone on this call or listening in would have had. You know, you've got your strategies, you've got your tactics, and you've got specific big things that your business has decided to do. We had worked through the last half of last year on a big brand campaign. We'd also been planning because of the dynamics in the markets and price changes. And we also had a major infrastructure investment going on. We're building New Zealand's largest wind farm. So these were three massive things that pretty much filled the hopper for what we were going to be supporting in the first, at least the half year from the start of 2020. We launched the brand campaign on Valentine's Day, choosing a nice moment in people's lives, and it was telling people to basically break up with oil, kiss goodbye, and it was quite pointy at another sector in the energy world, quite a brave sort of approach to things, and there was a lot of leverage work lined up, ready to go, and obviously within a couple of weeks, it was quite apparent that the mood of people to even be bothered listening to, you know, the renewable energy message, which otherwise has quite a fertile ground and quite a fertile audience, we'll be speaking to an audience of no one. So quite quickly, the marketing team got together and we got engaged in those conversations about what's appropriate, and it was pulled. We looked at examples overseas as well, where some campaigns were underway, and there's some really good things done. I forget who it was, but one company was able to move fast enough to donate their airtime across to another organization, a charitable trust. Because of the timing for us, there wasn't even the time for anyone else to have been able to have got ads ready to take our place. So we had to segue back to some old advertising that was lined up that was more benign. And in a way, it kept our brand presence, but and it also, the most important thing was that it didn't offend anyone. It was kind of bought some time to think about what the longer term response is going to be. At the same time, I mentioned a price increase. So we had announced that, again, early February. The way it works, a little bit like other financial interactions with customers, you have to tell your customer and then it takes some time before it plays out. So we had a month notice that we were giving customers that their price was increasing. So we'd gone out with those comms. A number of those people didn't face their price increases until basically we were a week out from or even just into lockdown. So that presented us with some very much reactive messaging we had to do to let them know the background, the validation for the price increase, which was backward looking. It was the increased costs that had been faced and the business had absorbed for 2 years without price increases. But it was tricky. It's tricky to navigate, and I think that moment of looking back and going, walk in the shoes of the customer, of course they're going to associate what's in front of them with what we've just told them as well. So the other aspect of the major plan was the wind farm that we're building. Obviously, lockdown meant we had a people issue with that. We also had community engagement that was locked in. We have a commitment to talk to the community once a month in face-to-face meetings. So my team had to work really hard to think about what's the best way to manage that. I think a couple of the key lessons out of all this, rather than to go into detail of it, is that work done prior and in and around and building relationships is fundamentally important. So with the community groups, some trust had been built up through the prior meetings. So when messages around the reasons why we had to change our plan for communicating and the environment we're in, they were pretty well accepted. We're also dealing a lot with partners involved in the build of the Turitea wind farm. They were facing major issues with staff being restricted from actually coming. So we had to put the whole project on pause, and that can lead to economic concerns in the region. And that's when the ability of, and it was people, not me, but that run our liaison group in Turitea related to the project, were able to quickly talk to relevant parties all about what was needing to be done, how can we secure the site, make it safe, how we can make sure that it's ready to get up and running as fast as possible to again support the regional community. So it enabled some good discussions to be held, and through those relationships, I think that was a key part of supporting it to be a positive outcome. In terms of our own communications plans, I think in a benign environment, away from issues like COVID-19 and other crises, you have the luxury of thinking and speaking in areas you might not otherwise. You can test the waters of comms channels, of ways of doing things. And we were sort of leaning out into those sort of areas in different ways. We'd had a couple of sort of paid for opportunities roundabout. What I think, what we did, and I think is a fair tactic for others to consider again, is bringing things right back to the core. You know, look again back at what's most important to the fundamental elements of your business, and then letting that guide your communications focus. So, in a sense, the analogy I put forward is it's kind of turning down the volume and turning up the tone button. So saying less, finding out about what is important to say, and even then testing it. You're more likely to get in trouble saying too much in this sort of environment than saying too little, although you never want to leave a void, and I think that was discussed in an earlier conversation as well. The tone is a really important one that I think, in Ngaire, your research had shown the importance of that earlier too. It's understanding how messages are going to land and not making assumptions about that. That was important for our price increase communications. We also faced a major challenge with the cost of electricity, and we put a hold on anyone facing disconnections, which is a terrible thing, the ultimate sanction for someone who doesn't pay. And of course, in that sort of time, you don't want to be front and center of the media having done that to anyone. But we were facing a group of customers building up large amounts of debt quite quickly on a product that was specifically designed to limit their buildup of debt. So we had to go back to stakeholders and go, and what we did, I think, was, it's worked out really well. We asked our stakeholders for some help with the problem. Say, look, this is, we feel compelled to do this, which is to reinstigate a degree of management of the collection and energy management process. They helped us a lot in saying, okay, well, if you're doing that, then there's some things you can do that you may have missed, and that's, you've got to get rid of these fees here, and you've got to engage more often to try and have the conversation to get them connected with support agencies. So we built a completely new process in the space of about a week, and then we were able to go back to those stakeholders, say thanks, because it was brilliant, their engagement on our behalf. And it's designed a much better product that helps the sustainability of this whole product called Glowbug probably right into the future. It's kind of revolutionized our approach to it through this crisis. So I think that was a really good lesson for our business out of that, and hopefully something that others can maybe consider how that applies in their area. Just checking a couple of things across that. Well, I think that there was a lot of talk about a word that's really come forward in the last couple of weeks and months is pivot, and businesses are having to go, well, our whole model is threatened, so we'll go over in this other direction. And I think there's just a bit of caution from a comms perspective in that. And I think the advice that I'd put forward from, again, some of my past experiences was put a pause in between the pivot and the decide from a comms, how do you support that? Test that the business is doing it for the right reason and what its underlying values are supposed to be, to figure out if it's a desperation pivot, then there can still be reasons for it, and you have to do your thing to support survival. But also, it won't be sustainable unless it's kind of true to the core of the business anyway. So take that time to pause and think about how it plays through the whole business, and the medium long term are still important kind of horizons to have in mind. So that's probably a bit of a download across these things quickly, and so very.
You've had a bit going on.
Yeah, and I don't think that's unusual across many people listening in, and I know Isentia themselves. Everyone's got the different versions of these types of challenges with customer, with people internally, with restructures that are having to happen, which are very difficult. And that's probably is one other thing that has been mentioned again in the past, the people element of in crises and situations such as this. The money aspect is one thing, but the time and effort in working with people and partners to understand their situations, there's a huge amount of value and payback from doing that well and genuinely from companies, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this has shown how important people and empathy and understanding and having that time to connect is. For everybody tuning in and connecting with us today, now is a fantastic time to ask any questions for Craig or for Ngaire. If there's something that you are wondering about, or something that either of these presenters of our Kiwi contingent today talked about that you'd like to know more about, I'd love if you could pop that in the questions area. What I think it would be good to keep talking about that people impact a little bit, Craig. Like what you just described over 2 and a bit months, or since February, of having to adapt professionally, having to make so many changes, change plans. What about so if we're talking about that adapting in a professional environment, what about the personal impact of working in a crisis, particularly for a comms person? Like what would you share about that personal impact?
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting consideration with COVID versus some other crises and comms issues that we might face as professionals. We've probably all been through the sorts of ones that are, burn brightly and then disappear quite quickly, and they can do damage along the way. Of course, through that, they can be pretty intense. I think recognizing that this is a long run challenge for all businesses and all people is pretty important at this time. And so in a way, that aspect of pause that I mentioned in relation to comms plans should be applied also personally. Like, take those times to consider your own pauses within the rush of stuff, because it helps make better decisions if you think you're heading in a certain direction. And I had a good lesson from that just in the last couple of days. We had a media issue in which the reporting of what we said was pretty harsh, and it re-litigated a thing for Mercury that was pretty strong and negative in our DNA, where there'd been a mistake over a decade ago, and it was reported again in a story yesterday. And there are a couple of people who really did take that to heart. And so in talking that through, realizing again to walk in the shoes of the media as well as everyone else, and think, what's the dynamic that's leading them to write the things they're writing, except that they have a not necessarily an agenda, but sometimes an agenda, but at least other dynamics that mean that they are compelled not to be mean to you, but just to do things you mightn't agree with. And so again, to take a breath, and actually our chief executive and our CFO both exchanged emails going, it's okay, guys, we understand, it's we're good with this. It's And that was useful. And one of the people who kind of was particularly impacted by it, who was involved in the situation over a decade ago, shared, though, again, some thoughts after she had paused, and that was, are we asking the right questions? Do we have the right people in the room? And I think there are a couple of good ones. What are we missing here when we give responses? So I think that they're three good questions, kind of the killer questions to just keep in mind for responses in work, but also personally. What are we missing here? What's the why did someone it might have annoyed you and you're feeling bad because of something someone said? Think about why they might have said it. Cut some slack right across the board on these things, because it's you're going to have to last the journey on this one.
Yeah, we've got some questions, killer questions coming through in our questions area as well.
Cool.
Claire has asked a couple of questions around the price increases, wondering how customers received the explanation on that and what you might be able to share there, and wondering if there were any challenges around that price increase. What were they? Is there more you can share about that with Claire and with all of us?
Yeah, I mean, there are ones that as a comms person you hate, and we face it at a regular cycle. I faced it in the insurance sector as well. Same fees increases in the bank world. They are a part of life where we have to deliver messages that the consumer is not going to be particularly happy with. So I think those early, we did work really hard at the comms early, and it looked at that clarity, compassion, and creativity is a hard one, because you don't want to be too flamboyant or too creative around information comms such as pricing. So we had some versions which kind of gave a lot of context up front and then came down to the message below. And actually it was within my team that are kind of going, actually, we know the reason for that, but actually still you got to get to the point. You got to get, tell it up front and then do the explanation for those people. If you got to that stage of, if someone kind of started reading the letter, didn't get to the end and threw it away, and then found their price increase later, it's not a good excuse to say, well, it was there, it was just kind of down the bottom. So it is that being up front, I think, is still a very important thing to do with communications like that. And then build in the other, the context and the reasons clearly, and tooling up our contact centers. They were the ones that had to face the calls from people, and we didn't get, in the end, I think because the original written in comms was pretty good. It did have the empathy and the compassion, but it was having to deal with the timing of it arriving right in the midst of COVID, people going, even though they hadn't lost a job, hadn't been affected particularly, but it was, how can you do this to people in general? And we had to give the backstory that there was, it was a little bit, if we'd known, we would, in fact, I'd say definitely if we'd known the circumstances, we wouldn't have done it, or we would have pulled it early. They were decisions that weren't available to us in these circumstances, but would have been considered.
Awesome. If you are listening in and you do have a question, we've probably got time for one or two more, so add that in the questions area. Nicole has asked Craig, what tools did you use to engage with stakeholders in the absence of those face-to-face forums?
Actually, we found a lot of sort of forgiveness among partners and things. They were, so our procurement team was a standout example who they basically got on the phone and phoned up suppliers and our procurement partners going, hope you're okay. We know we're just one of your, we received some of your goods. We aim on paying promptly. Anything else we can do to help? And there was gold in just doing that. So it became almost more the ability to be more personalized. So our person in that team who led that just thought it was a good idea. Asked for permission, but also just would have done it anyway. And having good people in the business, I think that's when you invest in those people early, and then they just do things like that. They help a lot. So and it doesn't take much. I got a text today from someone who used to work in the company. It's that just checking in, how you're doing, and it doesn't need to be the a half-hour Skype call on planning a strategy yet, but it can be, it's that soft, very soft approach, I think, is the way with all these stakeholders. So.
Yeah. One last question, Ngaire, before we wrap up, can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by demonstrating value? If anyone is listening in and thinks, okay, gosh, I've got to go and demonstrate my value, what should they be doing?
Yeah, and I come at this from the perspective this week that I've been judging some awards this week, some PR awards, and one of the things that I think is really easy to forget for communications people is that you are all generally wonderful storytellers, but there is a art to being able to explain to a business how you've made a contribution. And we bang on about it a lot in communications measurement about moving away from outputs. And this is still something that people are quite guilty of, that the idea of, if you send your board or CEO or senior leadership that, we got 70% positive media coverage, go us. That doesn't explain what impact you've had on the business. It doesn't explain how your strategy was thought out and why you did it the way that you did it. So what I mean is not buying in a bunch of research or consulting a bunch of experts. I just mean putting in that structure in place so that you can explain your thinking and explain your results and the direct impact. It may be that it's a small campaign that it may only move the needle a little bit, but in the wider context of a business objective, it's incredibly important to what the business needs right now. So there's a little bit of discipline that I love to see when people start to embrace what that structure looks like.
Awesome. One last question which has snuck in, Craig. I'm sure this is one that you can answer easily. What are the biggest changes do you predict will happen post-COVID for your business, but also for the way that you as an individual work? Are we all back to normal, or is this utopia not going to last for long? That question's from Pat that's just come through.
Yeah, I think I mentioned just before we went live, Ellie, that I'm a bit pessimistic about the ability of, in the macro sense, to embed positive change out of this. I've already seen sort of, transport here in Auckland's back towards the nightmare that it used to be. People are creatures of habit, and the habits are well embedded, and people drop back into them. I do hope that the work environment is one that can be transformed by this. We've got lots of positive lessons about connecting better in some instances by working from home. We had some people who joined in Skype calls before from externally, and everyone else is in a meeting room. We now know how that feels. And so, but with everyone in the Skype calls, we've equalized things. The power dynamic is far better. And so I think there is and the time of, I've had more time to read more widely and listen and learn stuff. And I want to carry that forward. And I think if others are also take those chances to spread their wings, even ask questions, what more can comms be? What more can, where else is the benefit of good communications? Then it can be fun times and a good creative time for us all going forward, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's exciting. There is an element of what can I retain? What can I keep here?
Yeah.
I'm going to wrap things up. I know that we could keep talking. Even what you just said, Craig, what more can comms be? That sounds like another webinar, I think. Like that sounds like another conversation for another day when people in New Zealand and a whole bunch of states in Australia have got a long weekend they're about to go into. Yeah. So that is all that we have got time for today. We will be running this session again, not Friday next week, but the one after. And we're going to be talking to Stella Muller from Bright Sunday. She's going to share a little bit of a case study around how important translating all of the COVID comms materials into 9 different Pacific languages was, how important that was to the overall success of containing COVID in New Zealand. So tune in 2 weeks' time if you would like to hear about that. We'll send some invites out shortly. And just one thing I wanted to flag with you as well is Isentia is partnering with the IABC to do a little bit of a report into exactly what we're talking about. What lies ahead for comms professionals over the next 12 months as a result of COVID, what's changing. So I'm just going to put a survey link in the chat if anyone would like to fill out a little bit of a survey for us. You can see that, and it will also be in the thank you email that comes through from this. We know that if you're joining this session, you're passionate about communications. We all are. So we'd love your thoughts and you participating in that research so we can share back to you what it is that we've found out. Now that really is all that we've got time for. Thank you so much, Ngaire, for tuning in and sharing your pearls of wisdom. And thank you, Craig, for a really fascinating whirlwind into what the last couple of months have looked like for you. I hope you've got something relaxing planned for the long weekend after all of that. It was really fascinating.
Cool. Thanks, Ali. Thanks, Ngaire.
No worries. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have an amazing weekend. See you at this session again soon. And thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. See you later. Bye.